Yokohama, Japan in 1939, and he immigrated to the United States in 1952. And he is one of the fortunate people who is fluent in a number of languages, Russian, Japanese, and English. And he earned his PhD in 1965 from Harvard University, where he studied under Roman Jacobson. Dr. Shapiro is a member of the Society of Senior Scholars at Columbia University, and he's Professor Emeritus of Slavic and Symbiotic Studies at Brown University. His professional career spanned the East and the West Coast, with appointments also at UCLA, Princeton, and UC Berkeley. Dr. Shapiro has few peers among Slavists due to his extensive range of knowledge and command of cultural, historical, and linguistic knowledge of English and Russian. Dr. Shapiro credits his work with his wife, Marianne Goldner, who was a known American Italianist, for his expanded knowledge of European literature, which is evidenced by the comparative scope of his teaching. His studies and exposure to philosophy, general linguistics, Slavic languages, and literatures have both broadened and deepened his expertise. The list of Dr. Shapiro's accomplishments, appointments, and accolades are numerous, and I invite you to explore his work and his lecture notes, which are available here in the library on reserve at the circulation desk. One of his recent works was reviewed, and it's the work The Speaking Self, Language, Lore, and English Usage. And this reviewer described reading Dr. Shapiro's book to having a conversation with an expert in linguistics. So please join me in giving Dr. Michael Shapiro a warm welcome to Eastern as Dr. Shapiro leads us into an enlightened and a provocative conversation about linguistics. Welcome.
Thank you. I hope everybody has a handout. And the handout is something that I put together in order for you to take home with you. You, of course, are free to throw it away when you leave, but it seems to me that it might be interesting. There's also, this is the first time. Thank you very much, Suzanne, for your introduction. And also I want to thank again Professors Gurkanov and Krug for inviting me. And I guess Vicki isn't here, right? Vicki Shields, the dean of the college, is not here, but she was also involved in inviting me. Can you all hear me? Yeah. In fact, I have a machine here that seems to amplify my voice, although I don't need it. Why not be technologically correct, right? You can be politically correct, but if you carry an iPhone, you're technologically correct, which I don't do. I still have the clamshell. I'm a bit of a fossil when it comes to technology, on purpose, of course. Yeah. I don't do anything that's not on purpose. A bit of prehistory might be interesting for you, because I'm a kind of rara avis, a rare bird, because I was born in Japan, as Suzanne mentioned, to Russian Jewish parents who were immigrants and lived there for 25 years. And I lived there for the first 12 years of my life, meaning through the World War. That's how I learned Japanese. My first language is Russian. We spoke Russian. And this was a family consisting of 5 sons, 2 parents, and a governess. I don't know if that word is in your vocabulary or not, but in those days, the wealthy Russians, when my parents were married, they had come both from wealthy families who had governesses. My father, for instance, had a governess come from England, Germany, and France. So he learned, they both spoke 5 languages fluently, which prepared them to be refugees, because they had to leave Russia. Well, my mother was born in China, and they met in Berlin, but my father was a Muscovite, and he had to leave because of the communist takeover. So I grew up in this milieu of 8 people sitting down for dinner every night. You know. There was no, 8 people were not going to go to the restaurant. And we were going to have a home-cooked meal. And my parents are they were classical musicians. My mother was a concert pianist, and my My father was a cellist, a conductor, a composer. They were both brilliant. I know I'm his son, I'm talking about his parents, but they were undeniably brilliant people. My mother was an immensely talented person who held the family together. Can you imagine 5 children? And I'm 9 years younger than my next oldest brother, so I think I was an afterthought. And we all boys spoke Russian at home because my father forbade us from speaking any other language at home. As soon as we stepped inside the house, we had to switch to Russian, even though we spoke Japanese and English outside the house. We all went to British or American schools. During the war, my older brothers went to Japanese schools because, the American school shut down. There is an American school in Tokyo, and which still exists, but it had to shut down because the Americans were no longer around. In fact, everybody who had a passport was deported from Japan. My parents did not have a passport, so the Japanese didn't know what to do with us. So they just said, okay, you can stay. And we were just residents. We had a permit. They even gave us during the famine, there was a famine during the war, they gave us all ration cards. That's the way the Japanese treated people in Japan. And they committed atrocities outside of Japan, but in Japan, the old rules obtained. So that's a kind of prehistory up to the point where my mother always said it was at my instigation that the family left Japan. My father didn't want to leave because he was perfectly happy. Males, especially foreign males in Japan, had a privileged life because they always won whatever contest there was, and everybody fawned on them and so on. But my mother, I think, was uncomfortable with the idea of staying in Japan forever. They had been there for 25 years when we left. And but she always said, I was the one. At 12 years old, I said, let's get out of here. I have no future. Let's go to America. So we went to Hollywood. So I graduated from Hollywood High. Guess how we got to Hollywood? My father saw palm trees on a postcard. And he said, let's go there. No, this is a true story. I think my mother had a cousin in LA, but that was about the extent of it. So there we were in Hollywood in the 50s. No smog, no traffic. You call it, Westwood Village was a village. So I ended up going to Hollywood High School together with Ricky Nelson. Does that name mean anything to you? He was on the tennis team with me. He was an excellent tennis player. He played varsity tennis. Poor guy, he died in a plane crash. Ozzie and Harriet, did they replay that at all? Okay. So David Nelson was there too. David, his older brother. I used to go to the Academy Awards. You could go on Hollywood Boulevard, sit in the stands, watch the stars come in. This doesn't happen anymore. And I went to UCLA. Why? I wanted to stay home. And the reason is, my parents were musicians. I became a clarinetist. We all started, everybody had to play the piano. My mother was my teacher. And then I said to her, I'd like to try another instrument when we came to America. And for some reason, which I don't understand now, to this day, I chose the clarinet. And I became a very good clarinetist. I played in concerts, chamber music, in the orchestra. I played the clarinet piano duo repertoire with my mother. We played trios together. Can you imagine? I hope you have this experience, because I'm convinced now that the strongest emotional bond you can have with someone you love is music. If you already love them, the musical connection gives you an emotional high that you cannot reproduce any other way. And it's well known that music is the most, of all the art forms, it's the one that has the most emotional power, the greatest power emotionally. And to my huge fortune, I married a woman who was an excellent pianist. My wife, Marianne, was so good that she was going to become a concert pianist, and her parents said, no, they're not going to pay for it. They were from Hungary, they were also from an emigre family. So this marriage was made in heaven. The two of us met, we fell in love immediately, and we only saw each other 9 times before we were married. Can you imagine? 9 times, and then we were married. And we stayed married until she died, unfortunately. 12 years ago she died. But we played the duo repertoire also. So my mother was obviously not living with us, but I had my pianist in the house. And then occasionally we played trios with other people. So this is the prehistory of where the handout starts out. Because my first entry, if you look on page 2, the salient points of the trajectory from 1965 to 2015, this is a half century of my career as being apperceived here. Gary? Apperceived? Apperceived, French word. Sometimes the French word is the only one that will do. Le bon mot, le bon mot. After I graduated from UCLA, this was 1961, I went to Harvard because I got a National Defense Foreign Language Fellowship. This was the Sputnik era, when people woke up and started giving money to people to study the so-called, what do they call endangered languages or something like that. I forget the critical languages. And it was critical because we had to catch up with the Russians. They had sent it in Sputnik. And so I got money from the government to go to study with the foremost linguist of the 20th century, Roman Jakobson. Yeah, his name is pronounced Jakobson because that's the way it is in Russian. Although it looks like Jacobson, but actually his name is Roman Jakobson. And he, to this day, is studied and read and so on. He was the leading Slavist and the leading linguist of the 20th century. And he taught at Harvard and MIT. Forget about Chomsky. Chomsky is going to be a long footnote in the history of linguistics, but Jakobson will live forever. I didn't get along with him. You know why? Because I was the nose-tweaking kind of student. For instance, I remember a hall as big as this with 100 people at Jakobson's. He was famous. So you'd have 100 students listening to a course on Russian poetry, imagine. Russian poetry and 100 students, most of them didn't know Russian, but anyway. I remember one day he opened his lecture with a reference to a poem that he was analyzing. And by some strange coincidence, I had read that poem that morning. And he misidentified it. So guess what Michael Shapiro did? He raised his hand and said, Professor Jakobson, it's not by X, it's by Y. And he argued with me to some degree. Well, I shut up, but I knew that he was wrong. And that is the way our relationship went. To the point where, until I got my degree in 1965, actually finished in 64, he was more or less reconciled to me, but you know what I did? He forced me to remove some chapters from my dissertation because I didn't agree with him. And guess what I did? I published them. The ones I removed from my dissertation, I published. This is not how to win friends and influence people. So our relationship was on the rocks, and he used to brag about me as his student, and then he would call on me in class to illustrate real good Russian, Whenever he wanted to illustrate to the class how something should be said in Russian, he would call on me. So I was a fair-haired boy until this moment, and then I compounded the thing by writing a review in the foremost journal in the world, language, linguistics journal, of a book that his student had published. And I blasted it because it was a lousy book. And it was full of false statements, wrong statements, and guess what happened? Jakobson only tolerated sycophants. He only liked people who praised him and said, yes, Professor so-and-so. And I was not that kind of student. So he attacked me in print. In fact, I was coming up for tenure at UCLA, and guess what he did? He picked up the phone and called the dean and said, "You can't give tenure to Shapiro." Those are the days. I don't know if that happens anymore. This is part of the sociology of knowledge. The sociology of knowledge, which I mentioned in my summary, is a department of sociology that was founded by French scholars at the beginning of the 20th century, like Durkheim and Mauss. I don't know if these names mean anything. Mauss is M-A-U-S-S, you know, it's like Mickey. You see my Mickey Mouse watch? Present for my daughter. He picked up the phone. You know, I found out from the chairman of my department, who, to his credit, threatened to resign as the managing editor of the journal that Jakobson was running, the best journal of Slavic linguistics in the world. He was the founder and the editor-in-chief, but he relied on my chairman to do the grunt work. And when my chairman found out, he said, "If you pursue this to Jakobson," who he was also his student from Harvard. You know, there was a kind of Harvard mafia in the world of slavistics. And he said, "If you do this kind of stuff, interfere," because I had already been proposed for tenure. "If you try to undo this, I'm going to resign as your managing editor." That did it. At that point. So things are not all that great in the world of academia. You know, I'm going to give you some ideas which will depress you, because this is only the beginning. Here I am, a young scholar. I was a living legend at Harvard because I finished in 3 years. Nobody did that. I took my generals in 2 years. I wrote my dissertation. I was finished in 3 years. 61 to 64. The reason my degree is 65 is they didn't award degrees after a certain date in 64, so I had to wait for March 65.
Tell us more about generals.
General exams, yeah. They call them generals at Harvard. I hated Harvard, by the way. You know why? Because everybody walked around with that stupid smile on their face. You know that holier than thou thing? You know, I don't know how to do that. Maybe they don't do that anymore. Well, they don't do it here. But anyway, as soon as I got there, I knew I had to get out, and that's why I got out in 3 years. And so Jakobson and I patched it up, sort of. One thing he did was he put it about that my Russian was tainted by a Yiddish accent, you know, which is completely false. But this is after he was calling on me in classes as an example of beautiful Russian, and then he put out that I had a Yiddish accent, you know. He was an apostate. He converted to Russian Orthodoxy. He came from a Jewish family and became a Russian Orthodox, which was, well, I don't know, in Russian they say по убеждению. That's by conviction. There used to be a distinction between someone who converted because it was professionally or somehow socially the thing to do, and there were people like that. And then there was the Russian phrase is by conviction, meaning that you really believed in this stuff, so you... And I had relatives who did that. Very famous one, Diktor Zhurmunsky. Zhurmunsky is a name, again, that will live forever because he did such important work. But it's not a household name. He was my cousin, Diktor Zhurmunsky. He was also a convert to Christianity. The atmosphere that was created by all this vindictiveness was, of course, very unpleasant, because here I was a young scholar trying to make my way, and my mentor is putting it about that I'm this, that, and the other thing, and we patched it up in some sense, and he said that this was some kind of, you know, he tried to make it out that there was some kind of psychiatric problem, killing the father, you know, that idea that you have to... I had a perfectly good father, I didn't need him and I didn't mean to kill him. I just disagreed with him. And he wasn't used to students disagreeing with him, because as I said, he loved sycophants. Someone would say, oh yes, Professor Jacobson, lovely and wonderful, whatever you say. That doesn't exist anymore. I mean, your students don't do that. The most important moments in my scholarly life are outlined. I'm not going to go through them, of course. Anyway, we should really wrap up this autobiographical stuff. The one thing I want to mention to you is my family life, which is very important to me, because my wife was a scholar. She was the most versatile and most accomplished scholar of Italian literature in America in the 20th century. There's no doubt about that. You know, it's not a matter of interpretation. It's just that if you actually do the research, you can see that there was nobody who produced more of lasting. She was a dentist, you know, and that's the main event. Unfortunately, she fell afoul of the academic mafia. She was a woman, she was Jewish, and she was smart. Those three things are a recipe for disaster in the field of Italian literature, especially Dante. Why Dante? Because you're supposed to play in your own sandbox. For a woman scholar, you're supposed to go off and do women's studies, you know, something that's on the periphery, it's not important. Dante that's it. That's the main event. And guess what? She was the best Dantist in the United States. The most accomplished, the most versatile. The Dante Society of America, which still exists, never invited her to give a lecture at their meeting. Why? The other thing was, when we got married, I was living in Los Angeles teaching at UCLA. So she moved out there. She was a New Yorker, born in Hungary, spoke Hungarian from this immigrant background. And they had hired her on false pretenses. She was a placeholder for an Italian who was a Fulbright scholar in the United States, who had to go, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with the Fulbright program. If you come from overseas, you have to go back to your country of origin before you come back to the United States. You can't get a job, at least in the old days. So the Italian department at UCLA hired her as if she were on a tenure track. You know, they made it look like she was on a tenure track, but in reality, she was a placeholder for someone who was a protege of a faculty member in Italian, male, of course. And so at the end of her 2-year contract, because in those days, you had to be renewed until you came up for tenure. It's probably still true, right? They put it out. I mean, they put it to the administration that she was incompetent. Imagine it. And when she protested, she went to the Committee on Privilege and Tenure. There was such a thing. I don't know if you have it at Eastern. You could protest. You know, if somebody did something nefarious to you as a faculty member, you could protest. It was called the Committee on Privilege and Tenure. And they upheld her protest. You know, 12 males, of course, there was a single woman, said, yes, you have a cause of action. And guess what the Vice Chancellor of UCLA said? Do you want me to trade, do you think that I will trade an assistant professor for a chairman? Because the chairman obviously lied. You know, false pretense is a nice way of saying lying, right? So that was his response. Can you imagine? So, at my instigation, which I'll never live down in my own head, I said, we've got to sue these sons of bitches. They cannot get away with this. That's the kind of guy I was. I wouldn't do that now. But that was me at, you know, in my 20s with a big ego saying, no, you can't just let this lie. You've got to sue the people that have treated you this way. Well, in those days, confidentiality ruled. No federal judge would force a university to disclose confidential information. And of course, the communication from the chairman to the vice chancellor had been privileged. It was confidential. So in the when it came to trial, the federal judge that was sitting on this case would not force them to reveal it. And so she could not get her job back, and she never got tenure. Imagine the most important dentists of the 20th century in the United States never had tenure. So that's the sociology of knowledge. Here you have someone who's contributing in a special way to the field, but the circumstances conspire to thwart somebody for reasons which have nothing to do with ideas or with the intellect or with scholarship. It has nothing to do with the subject. It has to do with the society that surrounds you. And people, it's always people, always dependent. Ideas don't just float around in space. Even physical sciences have to test people's acceptance of them. If you think of Galileo or Copernicus, I'm not saying it's of the same rank, but any ideas have to stand the test of time, and the test usually is administered by human beings who have interests that necessarily sometimes supersede scientific or scholarly interests. So there's always suppose that you're wrong and someone else is right. The big thing, the open thing, and the idealistic thing to do is to acknowledge that. Why? Because we're also subserving something higher than ourselves. This is the kind of idealism that frankly was inculcated in me by my parents. It was always some goal that was beyond individual vicissitudes. Peripetia, I put that in my summary just to teach you a word which is common in Russian, not in English. It's a Greek word. Ups and downs and all the things. Like in drama theater, no? Anybody take drama or as an actor? You know the things that happen in plays and belles lettres where things are up and down? The Greeks are good at that, because of Homer and so on. So that word, which is a Greek word, is very apt in relation to scholars, because we all have to jump through hoops, satisfy people. And now to bring it down to my own life, you can imagine what a terrible thing this was for our family. And at one point when my wife got a job at NYU, we were living in LA, I said, let's move. She was always against it. And I resigned from UCLA because to keep the family intact. For me, the most important thing was my wife and daughter. We had a daughter. Everything else was secondary. And, well, I described to you, we fell in love immediately, and we spent 24 hours a day together. Why? Because we were both scholars. So, in fact, I still have a partner's desk. Do you know what a partner's desk is? It's a desk where you have the same hardware on both sides. So you're sitting across from each other and you have exactly the same drawers, exactly the same. It's called a partner's desk. So there we were. We faced each other across a partner's desk. We collaborated. You'll see that some of the books we wrote were by both of us. And when people came to our apartment in New York and they saw our partner's desk, some of them would say, how can you work with facing your wife? How can you, they found that wild, that you can sit there and do your work and your wife is sitting across from you. Well, I had a very simple answer. I love my wife. Why can't I sit across the desk from her? Period. But anyway, this was the word tragedy is overused. It was a sequence of atrocities that were perpetrated by people in the academic world, the Italian mafia, the academic mafia. Well, here's another, to give you an illustration of the sociology of knowledge. There was a job in Seattle at the University of Washington for which my wife, because she kept trying to get a tenured job, she would apply one of these. So she would apply, and then the chairman of the department wrote her a letter and said, there's something strange going on. I am getting poison pen letters from people. Poison pen letters were being sent to the chairman by people that had nothing to do with the search. They were not her referees. These were people that had been put up to it by that guy that she sued at UCLA. And the chairman was so astounded at Seattle that he wrote her and said, we can't appoint you because we've got these letters in the file. Of course, he should have appointed her. He should have thrown those letters away. He didn't have the courage to do it. So people were writing letters against her candidacy on the assumption that she had did correctly, that she was a candidate for this tenure job at Seattle. They appointed one of their mafiosi. And then she died of cancer. And she told me once that she woke up every morning with a feeling of dread. And I'm convinced that what killed her was not the cancer, but it was this humiliation of many years of suffering through this kind of treatment by people. And I think oncologists now are finally coming around to the idea that your immune system is very, very vulnerable to stress and to a psychological side. In fact, I think psycho-oncology is a sub-discipline. Correct me if I'm wrong. There is such a thing now. Anyway, she died, she had a diagnosis which was unappealable. In other words, as soon as she was diagnosed, she knew she was dead. Because only less than 1% of females survive sarcoma. Sarcoma is a kind of cancer. And can you imagine walking around for almost 2 years knowing that you were going to die? On top of everything else. And I blame myself for not saving her. Okay, so much for morbidity. Questions? Comments? Rotten Tomatoes? Oh, I was instructed to tell you that my book is on sale at the bookstore. You can take one of these cards if you want. If you want to buy one, you have to pay the bookstore, don't pay me. And I'm going to a book signing at the end of this thing, which I've never done before. This book is available on Kindle too. I mean, if you want to get it electronically. This is only $12.95, so it seems to me, I don't know why this book is not being sold. It has 16 5-star reviews on Amazon. And I sell about 50 copies a year. I mean, which is kind of strange. I don't know. Anyway, it's not I'm going to...
So tell us a little bit about your book and guide us through.
Yeah, it's a book that's sui generis, It's by itself. Everybody who reads it, almost everybody that's reported to me has said that they don't know of a book of this kind. There's now a vogue for usage manuals. I don't know if you've noticed it. There are a lot of books coming out about the usage of English. There was that British woman that published a book called Eats, Leads, and Shoots or something, right? About commas and various other mistakes. And so there's a new one by a copy editor called Between You and Me, The History of the Comma, or something like that. So this is not in that, it's sort of in that field, but it's what I call linguistic vignettes about language usage, mostly English, and why people say things that they do. Yeah, please ask me questions.
Sure. Well, I just happen to have read the book, thanks to Professor Klukov, who loaned it to me, and
Yeah.
I have never read such a prescriptivist book in my life. And you're up very upfront about prescription.
Yeah, I'm a prescriptivist.
Yeah, and so maybe you could explain to the audience here the distinction between description and prescription in linguistics. But
Sure.
I wonder if you'd accept the mantle of polemic. These seem like many little polemics.
Yes.
Linguistic polemics.
But if you remember what I said about nose tweaking,
Yes. Yes.
that's my attitude, which I inherited from my father. My mother was always trying to temper his excesses. He's the kind of person that would say to a manager, a content manager, "You're an idiot, and you're not going to get any engagements." And unfortunately, I'm still Mishenka. You know, I'm the little boy.
What's
That's the diminutive of Michael. Mishenka. Yeah, my father used to say, Mishenka na zaboye. In Russian it means Michael is on the fence, because I used to climb up on a wall and run on it, and my father would be very apprehensive about that because I might fall. And he was known in the neighborhood in Tokyo as the worry company in Japanese. He would follow me and try to prevent me from falling. But that's my character. You know, if I'm being honest with you, I have to, you know, I can't make myself into somebody that I'm not. So, because why would that serve anybody? And I'm always, my father corrected our speech constantly. And guess what happened when I had a child? And she now corrects her children. I wish I were. Every time my grandson says, I wish I was, my daughter's on him like a, you know, I wish I were, and then he has to say it over again. Okay, and that prescriptivism, of course, is old-fashioned because descriptive linguistics, linguists as a group, especially in America, swore off being prescriptive. They wanted to see what people say and describe the language as it's actually spoken. Now, there are always some mastodons or fossils like me who stick to older norms. Norms change just like everything. Language is constantly changing. So my prescriptivism is polemical, but it actually is a kind of naturalized prescriptivism. It's in my nature because my upbringing, you know, speaking several languages, my parents were not academics. I mean, they taught, but they were musicians, but they were very punctilious about their language. And so I inherited that. And that's why my book reflects that attitude, and I'm unabashed about it. You know, I just made it's front and center in my introduction. I say at the risk of offending some readers, because some of the things I bring up as errors may be part of what they say, how they say it. I was thinking, and I have a blog that might interest you since we're now in that generation. I'm the only one that has, I think, a blog that's as comprehensive. I've not seen any other linguistics or language blog that's as comprehensive as mine. It's called languagelore.net. It's on your handout. Languagelore.net. And, you know, I have 20,000 visits a month, 900 people a day, supposedly. I don't know, is this botnets or what? Tell me what's going on. People are reading, they're clicking on these things, and I've got people giving me spam comments. I usually get 50 or 60 spam emails, mostly saying, I love your blog, but I want to sell you Viagra or Prado, or, you know, it's always some kind of commercial website, which I don't. It's spam. You have a spam blocker. But imagine getting 100 messages. You have to get rid of all these advertisements. But obviously, people are interested now in language usage. It's a tradition in English to have this kind of manual. Yes?
Well, I was just thinking, what you were describing is a very typical phenomenon for immigrants.
Yes.
Like, if, for example, there are lots of Russian immigrants and France, people who migrated in the 20s, and they have, it's already the third generation, but they still speak the language of the 20s. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there's this gap of understanding between people who speak the Russian language now and people who speak the Russian language, but they're immigrants from the 20s, or the kids of immigrants from the 20s. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a great layer of the language that you can actually look at and see how it was spoken.
Yeah.
So that's what you were describing.
Yeah.
Like the language your parents were speaking was the language of the past.
Yeah, well,
The language that...
you know, I speak Russian to
Yeah.
Professor Sturkanov and Sinikovo, so Igor is always telling me that I'm
Fantastic.
It's just all these idioms.
It's
from
absolutely
the years ago,
beautiful.
and I know really
Yeah, but this is what I learned. I learned from my parents. I've never lived in Russia. visited, but I never was an English-speaking environment.
Kind of people who really preserve the language,
Yeah.
which is definitely.
And, plus the overlay of all this punctiliousness about saying the right thing and not making mistakes. In fact, you know what my next book is going to be? Finally, it's going to be called Error, a Natural History, including jurisprudence and medicine. Because I'm fascinated by errors. I'm absolutely, if a psychiatrist were to interview me, it would come out. That I'm obsessed with the notion of error. And I think there is an academic subject there that's never been written, but there's no such thing. I investigated it. There's no book on error. There are errors. People have talked about errors in the physical sciences, like measurement. There's that concept of making errors in measurement, like the speed of light or, geodesy, swinging pendulums, that kind of thing. But to make a broad, to write a book that would comprehend all error in various fields, how people look on errors. Of course, speech errors are not as dangerous as medical errors. If somebody makes a mistake, you could die. If you make a grammatical mistake, okay. Nobody died.
Well, that depends,
Well,
though.
unless it's
Depends on
not-
how it's communicated. They may communicate something in a manner that isn't understood correctly, so somebody might think directly.
Yeah, it might lead to something unpleasant, yeah. But you don't want your doctor to misdiagnose you. And also jurisprudence, you can imagine, they're constantly talking about errors. Judges have to correct other judges, their appeals and so on. But I think a book is waiting to be written about that, about normativity, the whole concept of norm. But I call it error and natural history. To put it into a line of natural histories, as if I were a naturalist. More and more, I live in New York now, and I've become an anthropologist in my at the end of my life. All I do is observe what's going on around me, and the only reaction I have, except here in Spokane and in Eastern, is disgust and depression. Because living in Manhattan, I don't know if anybody here has lived there, it's so depressing, and everybody's getting old, all these people with walkers and minders, and everybody's trying to negotiate these stairs and subways and getting up and down from buses, and they can't hear. All my friends have had hip replacements or knee replacements, and they don't have hearing aids. They're in denial. You have to repeat everything 5 times. Luckily, I come from, my father died when he was 96 years. He was never sick. So I'm still reasonably alert, and I work out, play tennis, and so on. My goal is to die healthy, and when I say that, people laugh. But quality of life. Why would you want to? Yeah.
I'm just wondering about, I'm from Glasgow, where we take great delight in pulverising the English language. I think that sometimes error can be something that is quite positive in a cultural sense. If you go to Newcastle, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Belfast, Dublin, they all take great delight, I think, in twisting English, and their identity comes in part from the so-called errors they make, and sometimes they take great delight in that.
Yeah. But the whole concept of a standard language is relatively new. In European countries, there was no such thing as a standard until the Enlightenment and beyond. Really, the end of the 18th century and the 19th is when governments established standards and said, okay, this is standard English. Like in Britain, it's the Queen's English or the King's English. In Japan, there is a thing called standard Japanese, which is taught in the school. You're not going to, it's unusual now for a large country to allow dialects to be taught in schools. So there's, like in Germany, it's the Hochdeutsch, yeah. Dünaussprache, you have to learn how to speak as if they were speaking from the stage. In Japan, you cannot teach dialects in school.
But you know that they actually do. In Bavaria, they can.
Yeah, they can get away with it.
They do quite a bit until someone comes
Right.
in to recognize.
And they're very, they're very proud of their dialect, so they want to speak in their own language. Yeah.
As someone who grew up in the public school system in the U.S. and had a couple of, what shall I call, injuries inflicted through various positions of linguistics into
Mhm.
English classes.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking specifically of diagramming, and then
Sentences, yeah.
and then the idea that the TG, the whole, and then the idea that somehow grammar was necessary to understand writing, which was Frank O'Hare's big push in the language. Is there a place for linguistics in informing academic curricula in
Yes,
language and
I'm a very strong proponent of putting language back like the Tribune, the rhetoric, grammar, and logic. Because we think in language, we're not able to think any other way. Thought takes on the clothing of the language that you speak. You can have feelings, but whenever you are thinking, if you're already an adult, and children do that also at a certain point, they switch to, instead of saying grunts or making noises like dogs, they actually use speech. And so the fact that we as human beings are bound to language means that our thought is affected by how we formulate it. So that failures of grammar always translate for me into failures of thought. And to put language back into the center of the curriculum can only have an educative function. It's something which will educate people to think better, to not just expressing themselves better, but thinking better. The two are bound, and so logic, rhetoric, and grammar of the Tribune, that's the three things that used to go together, I think. And I'm now occasionally teaching at Columbia when they throw me a bone, which they don't do very often. Crumbs from the table because I'm retired and I'm not a Columbia emeritus, so I can see, and this happened to me at Brown too, at the end of my 16 years at Brown, which always boast that they're getting the cream of the crop, and people who pass out admissions to Harvard to go to Brown. Well, these kids couldn't write an English sentence correctly, grammatical mistakes, right, left, and center. And why should I correct grammar? I mean, there's supposed to be ideas I'm teaching this day. Actually, why should I bother with English grammar? So I would just say the hell with it. And if I get the notion that they're thinking about the subject correctly, but being a purist and a prescriptivist, it's very hard to get beyond that barrier of grammatical mistakes. But what I say is it's not an external, it's not some kind of externality. Isn't that what they say now? Everybody's talking about externalities. Grammatical mistake is not an externality. It's a betrayal of your capacity to think, because you can only think in language. So something is wrong. It's not that there isn't variation in language. I'm not saying that there aren't variants, like you said, that there are dialects and they may be perfectly coherent in that form of speech. But if we're all adhering to a standard, which this is inculcated in us, that we're all supposed to communicate in this standard language, this is a modern idea. There is a standard which is codified. So this code, when you have violations of the code, of course you could say, well, that's how languages change. They come up. They start out as errors, and then eventually they become part of the norm.
So is there an analogy here between the use of grammar and, say, the use of symbols in spoken language or written language, and say the use of symbols in physics?
Yes, there is, and also in music. I'd like to make the analogy between music. It's like not playing your instrument properly. You can't get away playing a Beethoven sonata and making mistakes. That's not going to fly. Beethoven put it down, so the norm that you're adhering to is what's written on the page. Beethoven is long dead, but you're not going to play a B flat where he wrote B, because you would be untrue to the code that is the written music.